All right, YouTube, it's time for occult literature video number 3 on Aradia, the Gospel of the Witches by Leland. Late 1800s work, so it's in sort of that Victorian era. It's different from most of the occult works that I've written in that it's really a tract upon anthropology. It's really an anthropological study of the Tuscan region of the Italian peninsula and the folkishness that was taking place at the time. Now, some people, and before I say that, link in the description, again, as always, to this specific work, the edition which I created, which has been edited mainly for format, and I re-illustrated it as well as a link to my books blog where you can get this and many other works as well. Many works on alchemy, grimoires, some of the things that I've written, both philosophical and more hands-on, Fruits of Eden, many titles available, and I'm just getting started. I'm not even 30 yet, so keep that in mind. As far as Leland's work here, I've seen people criticize it and say there was no such sort of witch cult in Italy at the time, but as has been pointed out, what Leland is actually suggesting is not a witch cult in the Christian sense. That is, a Christian, a fundamentalist, understands that to be a form of dark, black, satanic witchery or something like that. But really what we're seeing here is a pagan folkish movement around the same time that folkishness really, because of the alienation of the early industrial era taking hold in these places, things like herbal medicine, folk magic, folk ritualism, which hadn't really been around in great numbers since the dawn of the 1700s. You're really looking, unless you're in France at the time, you're going back to the late 1600s to find this in wide use beyond rural communities. We see a resurgence of it at that time. We certainly saw it in Germany during the interwar period, and I think we saw the result of that. What we saw in Italy, though, here with Leland's work, is probably a more or less authentic look at folk tradition. We shouldn't consider it an overarching religion. Some people took it to mean that there was an actual underground religion comprised of the majority of the rural population and perhaps at least a minority of the urban populations that were practicing what the Catholic Church would consider to be a form of pagan heresy. What I think we're instead seeing is that disconnected, especially rural communities that weren't part of that metropolitan industrialization, really retained the same sort of rites, the same sort of superstitions that they had in many cases long before. We're talking centuries before. They still venerated what would be very much considered Roman-style pagan gods, sometimes crossed over with Christianity. We have a look at several folk workings here as well. We have talk about what we may consider cryptids, or in a New Age sense, beings from another dimension. We have simple invocations as well. We have the lemon and pins sort of works, where you're taking a lemon, putting pins in it, and then making an invocation. And these things serve various purposes. We can see perhaps the French equivalent, the best French equivalent within anthropology, if we're talking strictly as skeptics here, not actual occultists per se. The closest thing I can think of is the Little Albert, which I also edited and released, the Petit Albert. If we look at that, what we're seeing is a cross-section of folk rites that were being used at the time. You don't have to take them seriously to appreciate that they were in wide circulation. These are healing arts, summoning rituals, superstitious little acts that people did to ward off a wolf, ward off a bear, fatten up the cows, make the crops grow, make it rain, make it not rain. All of these different folk traditions that were compiled there give us a cross-section of that time period in France and what was being done. Leland's work gives us the same in the late 1800s for Italy, specifically for the region of Tuscany. That is, he's proposing, and many others are proposing, there's an actual cult. I'm proposing that it's simply a folk art, that it coexists with Christianity, was overlooked, and people never saw a problem with it because their ancestors had done the same thing. These are remote communities. They were not necessarily entangled quite so much with the control of central government, with the control of centralized religion. That being said, it's still interesting. There are a great many invocations here, and it's also philosophical. It really is Romanesque. When you look at it, it's very much taken off of literal Roman paganism circa, 400 AD or thereabouts. So we're looking back many, many centuries before Leland's actual work, and we have to assume there was evolution of these things over time. Of course, the lemon may have been an orange at some point in the past, or the wolf may have been a stand-in for a dog or something. Symbology evolves over time, but we're still getting a good look at these things. Again, link in the description if you would enjoy buying a copy of the Aradia, The Witch's Gospel. Link to my books blog where other titles are available. This one comes strongly recommended. Leland's work is genius, not only for those of us who are more interested in the actual occultism of the occult, as in the practice or study explicitly of the occult itself, but also for skeptics who simply want an interesting, what we could term an anthropological or a sociological look at that time period, isolated from modernity. Of course, now we have the internet and it muddies the waters and traditions get lost and rediscovered, and people spin all these elaborate theories about mythology and about folk practice, and a million booklets have been written in, the last 10 days probably about these subjects, about little folk curses and stuff. That's all well and good, but this is pre-internet era. This is pre-television. This is pre-radio. This is probably a more authentic look at an area that at the time had not yet fully industrialized. The rural outlying regions and small towns were very much folkish. They continued to live as people had 1,000 years before, more or less. You wouldn't have seen automobiles roaming around Tuscany at the time. You would have seen little more than some scattered farms, a few towns, and people literally tending their crops and going out and playing on a harp in the fields. It really would have been a pastoral look at what was then an underdeveloped region of the world. It wasn't London, it wasn't New York City, it wasn't Paris or Berlin. It was the middle of nowhere in the Italian peninsula, really, at the time. That's about all. Peace out.